Alright guys, so if you remember, Mr. Heck Jones has just visited Mr. McBroom and tried to take the farm away from him because he realized that the farm is doing so well, and although he tried to trick him with it, it's actually a pretty good place because he's growing plants and vegetables so quickly. And so he tried to trick him, saying that he owed him 3 milky white moths, and didn't think that Mr. McBroom could get them because it was during the day. But Mr. McBroom outsmarted him and found some seeds to plant trees and made like a little forest and found moths. So, and then they used the wood from the trees to build a house. So let's see what happens. But I don't want you to think that there was nothing but work on the farm. Some crops we grew just for the fun of it. Take pumpkins. The vines grew so fast we could hardly catch the pumpkins. It was something to see. The youngsters used to wear themselves out running after those pumpkins. Sometimes they'd have pumpkin races. Sunday afternoons just for the sport of it. The older boys would plant a pumpkin seed and try to catch a ride. It wasn't easy. You had to grab hold the instant the blossom dropped off the pumpkin, and the pumpkin began to swell. Whoosh! It would yank you off your feet and take you whizzling over the farm until it wore itself out. Sometimes they'd use banana squash, which is faster. And the girls learned to ride corn stalks like pogo sticks. It was just a matter of standing over the kernel as the stalk came busting up through the ground. It was good for quite a bounce. We'd see Mr. Heck Jones standing on the hill in the distance watching. He wasn't going to rest until he had pried us off our land. Then late one night I was awakened by a hee-haw outside the house. I went to the window and saw old Mr. Heck Jones in the moonlight. He was crackling and a-cackling and a-chuckling and a-heeing and a-hawing and a-sprinkling seed every which way. I pulled my sleep cap on and rushed outside. "What mischief are you up to, Neighbor Jones?" I shouted. "Hee-haw," he answered and scurried away, laughing up his sleeve. I had a sleepless night, as you can imagine. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, the farm of ours broke out in weeds. You've never seen such weeds. They heaved out of the ground and tumbled madly over each other. Chickweed and milkweed and thistles and wild morning glory. In no time at all, the weeds were in a tangle several feet thick and still rising. We had a fight on our hands, I tell you. "Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorette," I shouted. "There's work to be done." So we started hoeing and hacking away. For every weed we uprooted, another reseeded itself. We were a solid month battling those weeds. If our neighbors hadn't pitched in to help, well, we'd still be burning those weeds. The day finally came when the farm was cleared, and up popped Mr. Old Heck Jones. He was eating a big slice of watermelon. But that's what he's going to tell us. That's what I've been telling you. That's what I was going to tell you about. "Howdy, Mr. McBroom," he said. "I came to say goodbye." "Are you leaving, sir?" I asked. "No, but you are." I looked him squarely in the eye. "And if I don't, sir?" "Why, hee-haw, McBroom. There's heaps more of that weed seed where that came from." My dander was up, and I rolled back my sleeves, meaning to give him a whipping he'd never forget. But what happened next saved me the bother. As my youngsters gathered round, Mr. Old Heck Jones made the mistake of spitting out a mouthful of watermelon seeds. Things did happen quick. Before I had quite realized what he had done, a watermelon vine whipped up around Mr. Old Heck's scrawny legs and jerked him off his feet. He went whizzling every which way over the farm. Watermelon seeds were a-flying. Soon he came zipping back and collided with a pumpkin left over from Sunday. In no time, watermelons and pumpkins were galloping all over the place, and they were knocking him about something wild. He streaked here and he streaked there, and melons crashed and exploded. Old Mr. Heck was covered with melon pulp. He looked like he had been shot out of a ketchup bottle. It was something to see, I tell ya. Will stood there wiggling his ears, and Jill crossed her eyes, and Chester twitched his nose, and Hester flapped her arms like a bird. Peter whistled through his front teeth, which had grown in, and Tom stood on his head, and little Cloretta, well, she took her first step. By then, the watermelons and the pumpkins began to play themselves out, and I figured Mr. Heck Jones would like to get home as fast as possible. So I asked Larry to fetch me the seed of a large banana squash. "Hee-haw, Neighbor Jones," I said, and pitched the seed to his feet. I hardly had time to say goodbye before the vine had him. A long banana squash gave him the fast ride all the way home. I wished you could have been there to see it. That's the entire truth on that matter. Anything else you hear about Mr. McBroom's wonderful 1-acre farm is an outright fib. All right, guys, on to the next chapter, McBroom and the Big Wind. You guys see it? I can't deny it. It does get a mite windy out here on the prairie. Why, just last year, a blow came a-ripping across our farm and carried off a pail of sweet milk, and the next day it came back for the cow. But that wasn't the howling, scowling, almighty big wind I'm about to tell you about. That was just a common little prairie breeze. No account, really. Hardly worth bragging about. It was the big wind that broke my leg. I don't expect you to believe that yet. I'd best start with some small weather and work up to the bone breaker. So he's calling that wind the bone breaker because he broke his leg. I remember distinctly the first prairie wind that came a-scampering along after we bought our wonderful 1-acre farm. My, that land is rich. Best topsoil in the country. There isn't a thing that won't grow in our rich topsoil. And fast as lightning. That morning I'm talking about, our oldest boys were helping me to shingle the roof. I had bought a keg of nails, but it turned out those nails were a whit short. But we buried them in our wonderful topsoil and watered them, and in 5 or 10 minutes those nails grew half an inch. Now there's no way that happened. So they were up on the roof, hammering down the shingles. There wasn't a cloud in the sky at first, and then the younger boys were shooting marbles all over the farm, and the girls were jumping rope. When I had pounded down the last shingle, I said to myself, "Josh McBroom, that's a mighty stout roof. It'll last 100 years. Just then I felt a small draft on the back of my neck, and a moment later one of the girls, it was Polly, I recall, shouted to me, "Pa," she said, "do jackrabbits have wings?" Jackrabbit is like a normal rabbit, but that's out in the prairie out west. So they're kind of bigger, I think, than normal rabbits. I laughed. "No, Polly." "Then how come there's a flock of flying jackrabbits over the house?" I looked up, and mercy be, rabbits were a-flapping their ears across the sky in a perfect V formation, northbound, and I knew we were in for a slight blow. "Run, everybody!" I shouted to the young'uns, and I didn't want the wind picking them up by their ears. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and the little Cloretta in the house. Scamper! The clothesline was already beginning to whip around like a jump rope. My dear wife Melissa, who had been baking a heap of biscuits, threw open the door, and we all dashed in, and not a moment too soon. The wind was snapping at our heels like a pack of wolves. It aimed to barge right in and make itself at home. A prairie wind has no manners at all. We slammed the door in its teeth. Now the wind didn't take that politely, and it rammed and battered at the door, while all of us pushed and shoved to hold the door shut. My, it was a battle. How the house did creak and tremble. "Push, my lambs," I said. Shove!" At times the door planks bent like barrel staves, but we held that roaring wind out. When it saw there was no getting past us, it sneaked around the house to the back door. However, our oldest boy, Will, was too smart for it. He piled Mama's heaps of fresh biscuits against the back door. My dear Melissa is a wonderful cook, but her biscuits are terribly heavy. They made a splendid doorstop. But what worried me the most was our wondrous rich topsoil. That thieving wind was apt to make off with it, leaving us with a trifling hole in the ground. "Shove, my lambs," I said. "Push!" And the battle raged on for an hour. Finally the wind gave up, butting its foolish head against the door, when a great angry sigh turned around and whisked itself away, scattering fence pickets as it went. We all took a deep breath, and I opened the door a crack. Hardly a leaf now stirred on the ground. A bird began to twitter, and I rushed outside to our poor 1-acre farm. We'll have to see what happens tomorrow.